Okay, hello everyone. Morning. I'm Rachel Kelly and I'm from Manchester School of Art, and I'm here to present the findings from the Cordillera Textiles project, which is a multidisciplinary research project run from 2016 to 2020, which has been led by Professor Annalyn Salvador Amores from the University of Philippines in Baguio. Can I just check, can you hear me? You can, yeah. Okay. The Cordillera project set out to document textiles that can no longer be woven by communities in the Cordillera region of the northern Philippines. This is due to the demise of master weavers and poor take-up by young people to learn to become weavers. The project is seeking to raise the voice and visibility of oral craft traditions and to explore the opportunities digital tools and methods may play in sustaining a future for traditional craft practice. I, along with other textile academics from across the world, were invited to work on the project, and myself and colleagues from Manchester School of Art were funded initially from a British Council Crafting Futures grant, and I then applied to the MMU Global Challenges Research Fund for a very small grant, and we also received a little bit of money from the University of the Philippines. Okay, so the project I'm presenting today is relevant to this Symposium of Design, Research and Change because we're seeking to understand how design-orientated thinking, from understanding to materialisation after cross, can support cultural change within practice-based context and settings. The main aims of the Cordillera project were to rejuvenate interest in traditional weaving in the region, to provide comprehensive anthropological and technical information, to develop design protocols to improve the textiles from locally sourced materials and with the use of new technology, and finally, to introduce weave education into communities and schools. The research so far builds upon a field visit undertaken by myself and my colleague, Dr. Michelle Stevens from Manchester School of Art. Our main research output for this project is a learning toolkit, which includes a small sample loom, weaving drafts, design instruction, and weave samples. A final published and printed version, including a children's version of this kit, is being planned for dissemination next year. We used the Nesta theory of change model to develop the research design. The theory of change enabled us to focus on the practical steps, the measurable effects, wider benefits, and ultimately the long-term change goals we were envisaging. The Crafting Futures project in particular is enabling practitioners to openly explore the research context. The space we were given allowed us to seek out the full picture within this context and to notice precisely what was happening there. We did this mainly within our in-depth field visit to the Cordilleran communities, where we were able to follow Donald Schoen's concept to problem set and problem solve simultaneously. The Cordilleran communities are identified by their ethno-linguistic languages, which define their culture. The Cordillera comprises of multiple ethno-linguistic groups who were traditionally a society made up of rivalrous groups with a reputation for wildness and indeed headhunting. The communities have held on to their traditions following challenging periods of colonialisation. Where they were once rich crafts and forest people, the introduction of money, mixed marriages, Western religious beliefs, in particular during the early 20th century, a sense of the outside came into their sacred communities and created irreversible change. The Cordillera are now poor and mostly live below the poverty line. In 1997, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act was passed, which meant that the domains of the rice terraces and forests now belong to the communities. The rice terraces were also inscribed as a UNESCO heritage status in 1995, and this has gone some further way to provide support to these regional populations. However, while the territory is returned to the stewardship of the Cordillera, the area now faces environmentally induced problems due to deforestation and the resulting global warming. There is an increased risk of landslides, and for those who have now moved to live near the deltas or by the sea, there's a continual risk of flooding and tsunamis. The Ifugao community, who just saw in their costumes just there, we visited, are still located in a place of land in the mountains. The Ifugao believe the trees harbour the spirits of their ancestors, and seedlings are planted after the birth of a child. The forests and trees of the mountains are important to the Cordillera and link directly to the incredible backstrap loom weaving tradition, where specific woods are used to make different weaving tools. This project has identified that while there have been irreversible losses in the Cordillera, much of the culture and knowledge remains. The learning processes within the oral tradition happen when weaving knowledge is passed from an elder to a child. The issue today with the oral process is that it takes time and the knowledge is limited between two people. Our research is seeking to provide tools and interventions to expand rather than limit this knowledge exchange potential. We are also considering that the preservation and continuation of traditions as they stand may be taking a form of neurotic aimlessness, a term borrowed from Annie Albers in reference to the continuation of hand-weaving practices merely for the sake of preservation. The maintenance of oral tradition does play some part in the sense that the past is merely repeating itself. A key moment for our research was the final day of our field visit, when after a workshop held at the university, the participating weavers were offered a tour of the Corditex project archives. While the weavers were amused at coming face to face with the work of their ancestors, there was a palpable sense of concern. There was a huge contrast between the circumstances of the weavers and the high-tech air-controlled archive we introduced them to. It was somewhat chilling. As we progress our research, we must consider the differences between academic and inherited practices and the languages and rituals we all bring to our work. During the workshop we ran at the university, we asked if we could bring the samples out of the archives for the weavers to study, translate and handle with gloves. A key threshold of this research was passed when we introduced the process of weave drafting to the communities. Drafting, meaning the process of writing down the weave design and structure, was something new. We, as part of our methodology, wanted to enable the weavers to learn from their practices. And this was a step which changed the power from only being with the community shared experience to an individual interpretation and authorship. In learning how to write down a weave pattern and draft from scratch, a weaver's design vocabulary becomes immediately personalised and potentially infinite. There are other problems which underpin the decline of textile making from this, which come from a wider context. The introduction of fertilisers to the forests and rice terraces in the pre-1990s have created problems which have entirely upset the biodiverse water systems of this area. The weavers, who are mainly women, articulated to us in our workshops that due to the increasing typhoon seasons and biodiversity problems, that rice growing, which is the main source of income, is becoming less reliable and more dangerous. They stated that weaving is now really important to maintain because these women can weave in all weathers while keeping the home, looking after elders and children. Such reflections have enabled us to understand that the economic motivation may be replacing the spiritual and cultural motivations to weave. In a paper which documents new farming subcultures by Glover and Stone, they identify that culture can be used to create a fetishization to attract trade. There is a growing subcultural network emerging from the Cordillera via new rice farming methods. And this is suggesting that the manner in which the communities have managed to recommodify rice could be applied to textiles. Organic Philippine cotton, which used... Oh, no, I'm going to leave that bit, actually. No. How am I doing for time? I'm okay, I'm fine. Organic Philippine cotton, which used to proliferate as a crop within the Philippines, embodies a symbiotic relationship between agriculture and weaving. And this broke down in the mid-20th century. Smaller crops of Philippine cotton are now being grown today and sold for export before they're even planted. The Corditex set as a standard to improve the woven product and return to Philippine cotton and natural dye. But there is some sense that we might be bolting the door after the horse has escaped. During our workshop, we invited the president of the Habay Textile Council, who support the Philippine textile industry, and they've created an intervention where they are supplying Philippine cotton growing kits, including a coconut pot and fertiliser, to the weavers. We consider this a serious intervention because there's a sense of urgency and need within this project. And this is where the Corditex remit needs to be clear. In planning our initial research, we employed a deep hanging out methodology, and we sidelined some research apparatus in favour of a practitioner hands-on approach. We took with us into the field a practitioner's toolkit of weave samples, small sample looms, yarn swatches, pens and graph paper. We had workshop plans to hand, but we wanted any demonstration that we were going to give to be invited by the weavers rather than imposed. We used ethics forms to seek approval and used the data we were collecting to support our research. This raised no issues, but it was the only point we stepped away from our practitioner identity into that of researcher. We undertook 2 types of research during our 9-day visit. We travelled to the mountain and delta communities to meet with small weaving groups in their homes and workshops. We also held a 35-participant workshop at the University of Baguio. The difference between the 2 research sites were that when we were on the weavers' territory, we faced some initial hostility. The workshop in Baguio was much more like a meeting of minds and the beginning of a community of practice. We visited the ITNEG group, who hold a superior position and hierarchy among the weaving communities due to the complexity and fineness of the cotton they use. However, this group are at most risk of disappearing. The ITNEG have formed a community set up in a garage. You might have seen the images so far. The women weavers we all met were united in their view as to why weaving was declining in their community. There was a sense of despair that the young were either not prepared or interested in learning to weave. A shift in the tone of our visit came when my colleague, Michelle, showed the weavers some examples of her work on her mobile phone. The weavers, in a sense, decided after their initial ambivalence to listen to us because they were more interested in talking about weaving than talking about the problems in their community. The exchange with the phone opened up the dialogue, and we were able to introduce drafting methods to them. Weave drafts are a locus of agency, cites Mills. And while the writing of a draft is the first step away from the oral tradition, for these women, it was the first time they had written their designs down. This visit ended with the weavers sitting outside in the fresh air, continuing to draft their patterns after we had left. The weavers' potential for creative agency has arguably expanded, cites Mills, and that the most cutting-edge technology and automation of the TC digital loom can enable weaving's oldest traditions, form and image making, to re-emerge. Since January, we've been taking a closer look at the choices such women face. The workshops we held and the theoretical perspectives considered have enabled us to understand better the voices of the Cordillera weavers and the troubles they face. The main workshop we held at the university was attended, along with the participants, by the Government Department of Science and Technology. We used methods within the workshop to reflect a pedagogic process to suit the wide range of contexts, languages and stakeholders. And we used Lego as a visualisation method to enable the participants to think through making and to find a shape for their thoughts. We asked questions and we listened, allowing the participants to speak. Their insights were about the peace that their practice brings, that the women's ability to weave at home, close to the family, and the value of weaving as a source of income now that rice harvesting is becoming problematic. On return from the Philippines, we began to work on the learning toolkit, including the creation of digital weave teaching samples, design translations and loom kits. And we're seeking further funding to become more involved in the next part of the project. We have identified that the development of a new weaving subculture will encourage younger weavers to become involved. And if they have the chance to layer their voices onto their ancestors and not just repeat their patterns. Find a page, There has been an incredible development since July when the Department of Science and Technology decided to introduce backstrap loom weaving into the K-12 schools curriculum for children aged 6 to 12. And we are closely monitoring this development. We have asked many questions within this project, in particular with regard to any negative impact that the change in tradition might create. We are considering the premise that the individual weavers are all embodying their culture and that this culture is somewhat psychologically and socially distributed in the group. The collective culture can embody and encompass the practice, but we have evidence that the weavers are articulating via their responses to the tools we've introduced and via their reflections in our workshops that they are seeking space to grow and develop their practices. What was observed by this project was an ideal of weaving practice, which places the women weavers at the centre of their communities and supports the sustainability of ethno-linguistic cultures. The patterns of the Cordillera only take on meaning when they are spoken or woven. The woven cloths of the Cordillera become a culture, which enables an eternal conversation to take place between the community ancestors and the current stewards of this unique tradition. The weavers use weaving as a practice to bring meaning and understanding to their world. And the oral tradition between masters and apprentices creates a richness they own. But the process is too slow to sustain and, we could say, is somewhat inhibiting. Therefore, the introduction of education-based interventions, which might include the digitisation of weaving, if enabled freely via a sustainable learning framework, could support a new oral tradition and sustainable future for Cordillera weaving. Thank you.
Fantastic. We've got some time for a few questions. We need to run about with a microphone.
I kind of galloped through that. I'm here for the whole symposium, and I have got information, and I've got the publication with me as well, so in case anyone has longer to think about questions.
Any questions? Observations? Yep.
Talk a little bit more about the choices that the weavers make once they have drafted their pattern. So how do they, interpret the code? I would like to hear more about that.
Well, we were only at the beginning of that process, so they've just started to draft the patterns. So that's kind of the next part of the research. Yeah. But immediately when they started drafting the patterns, they started making up new patterns straight away. Yeah.
You observed that when you did your research in the two sites, the community site, there was some hostility. I just wondered if you'd say a bit more about that and what you thought that was about.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge aspect of it. And I think what was so important was prior to travelling and in our planning, we'd made the decision that we were going as practitioners and not as researchers. So that gave us some kind of confidence and rationale in that we've stood in the same room as the weavers, or the same garage. Yeah, it was very difficult. And I do feel that actually, in a way, it was maybe the Corditex project that created that difficulty, because the Corditex project, being a multidisciplinary project, it included anthropologists and scientists and some mathematicians as well. And we felt that their approach was quite academic, and there was a sense of otherness. And Michelle and I certainly were working to bridge the gap in every aspect of how we behaved, from the kits we took with us, the fact that we took fabric and materials. I think the way that we sort of spoke and acted and engaged with the communities, it was only through that personal interaction that we gained their confidence.
Hi, Rachel. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Rachel. That's just so interesting. Can I ask? I was really interested in the fact that the young people weren't interested in it, yes. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about why. And it's just so great that that they're introducing into the curriculum in schools. That's great, but why weren't they? And how do you inspire? Okay, it's in schools, but it's going to be more than that, isn't it? If they're really where are they going to take it in the future? What are they going to do with it? Have you had any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, the main reason is that they're moving to the cities to seek employment and to move away from the communities. And that's really an economic decision, because they are living, in quite difficult circumstances. But also there is this kind of, I suppose, intimidation from the oral tradition of that sort of closeness to the grandparent and that relationship. There's no space for them to grow. So the opportunity we created by having the workshop at the university, they're bringing the digital looms into the university, and that's going to be a route for the young people to be able to go and learn weaving outside of the family, which is a big change. And we hope that the sort of the innovation, the creativity, the practice of design will inspire them to continue the tradition. But the idea is that if the younger children are introduced earlier that you know, it would be more sustainable. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic.
Thank you.
As Rachel said,